Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be doing a live stream of looking at automating Twitter based on events that happen to GitHub. And we're going to be using GitHub eventing and GitHub Actions. We're going to use Bash for our logic. And we're going to look at our plan as our bash is kind of an intermediate step. And we're going to look at our long-term plan as to how over time we're going to meet all our needs that are, desires of what we want to do from automating social media posting. But let's go ahead and dive in and start with looking at the plan and some of why we're looking at the path that I'm planning on building out and look at building it out. So first, you can see here, I got the Modern Apps Learning homepage filled up. And we also have a Modern Apps Learning Twitter page. And on Modern Apps Learning Twitter, I try to manually uh, tweet when people post new content, when members of the community earn a certificate or what have you. But I can't keep up with that manually. And it's it's wasteful. For things like that that should be automated. Why there are very very repetitive activities. There's other things like I still plan to go into this channel to repost things that aren't necessarily hosted on the Modern Apps Learning program, just other related topics, and to give it some manual touch. But for the routine repetitive things that we know we want to retreat on a regular basis, it's a no-brainer to go ahead and automate those things. So oops, let's go back to, so what types of things do we want to retweet, or what do we want to automate tweeting? One is, what about if somebody posts a new course or a new tutorial or a new guide? Absolutely, right? And then in the context of courses, what if a member of the community earns a new badge and what have you, other things like that? Then we currently we process all features, all automated features that require logic uh, in the platform are processed with GitHub Actions. We plan to expand that as we have new features that we want to add that dive outside of into a broader array of different capabilities. But right now, everything we have to date is really centered around GitHub Actions. And so already, like if, let's say, for example, I want to have it tweet when someone earns a certificate of completion, I already have a GitHub action in place now that handles processing for when somebody requests a certificate of completion. So in that case, it would be a simple matter of going in and adding to the action script we already have for that, or action GitHub action we already have for that. And at the same time, there's other ones right now that I don't already really have any automated handlers set up for. Like, for example, currently if somebody posts a tutorial with a simple approval process, we don't, I'm not using any event triggers or automated workflows to do any particular type of processing of, when someone um, opens a pull request to post a tutorial or when that's approved. It's a very much straightforward manual approval process. So I definitely want to automate tweets when someone posts a new tutorial content. And so we'll look at some GitHub Action logic that I recently worked out that works really well for that use case, and how how we can get some nice controls around that. Yeah, so I think pretty straightforward idea. Uh, Automating tweets kind of a nice thing. Now let's talk about how we're going to do it. Um, there's a couple different ways. I think when you're using GitHub Actions, well, the first is, like, I think one of our biggest goals, and this is really important when we think about modern logic design. I say logic design because this isn't just application development. Right? If you're working in DevOps, like I am more from the ops side of DevOps. I am not a developer, but I think if you get more and more into DevOps, you're going to learn some development concepts if you get deeper and deeper into it, and hopefully both dev and ops can glean some good practices from each other. But and in particular, when we talk about the idea of development, historically, like we've that's often been talked about in terms of of developing a end user facing application. But that's not the only thing we develop, right? If let's say an IT infrastructure department is going to say, we're going to provide a self-service experience around something, right? And it's an engineered solution. It is not like I just bought something and turned it on and someone opened a trouble ticket and we gave them stuff, right? Like if we have a properly engineered solution, that's always a development effort. And, there's one question is how much code it will contain. But in generally, when we're moving into this world of, even from an operational standpoint, automating infrastructure processes, automating infrastructure as code, automating everything that we can, even from an ops perspective, even if you're not using any traditional programming languages, you can be using workflow automation tools and scripting languages and so on to handle those automation processes and help to automate and streamline our workflows. And so whether you're coming from a developer standpoint, whether you're coming from an operator standpoint, it's really some important things to think about as we're designing logic. So the first is how can we tweet, right? We can go to the GitHub API directly, right? Write some code, and then there you go, right? Tweet that way. That's pretty straightforward. We know exactly what we're getting. GitHub, making API calls is not that difficult. The GitHub API is far from the most difficult API to script some basic calls to, but not the easiest either. But let's think about that. Like one of one of our big goals in designing a workflow is to make it as resilient as we can, right? And because ideally we get it in place, it automates something that we like to do, and then we start doing the thing we set it up for. And it just works, and we get used to this idea that there's an automation there until one day it breaks, right? And why would it break? Well, it would break because of dependencies, right? Because of change, right? Because of change. So now let's think when what would change and why, right? Well, I have my code that does something. And in and of itself, unless I choose to change my code, that doesn't change, right? Then there are dependencies, right? And therein, lies a big challenge, right? Whether I'm depending on other things. So in this case, I'm depending on the Twitter API, right? And then there's another level of dependency too, in that if I'm running something somewhere, I'm dependent on, when you think about security vulnerabilities, there's always a possibility that my code itself I've done something wrong in my simple code. But I think, especially if you're doing something simple, right, is equally large or larger chance that somewhere in your runtime, somewhere in the tooling that you're using, somewhere in your container layers or what have you, there's always external things going on with security, and something that you're dependent on may have a security thing. That's a dependency, right? And that's another one is like I say, I'm dependent on that GitHub API. Now let's just think about a Bash client and making an API call. Right? Because that's not, we're not running much there that outside of a properly formed Bash, making sure our Bash script is according to best practice, that has a lot of surface area for attack. Very, very simple thing. And in that case, if anything's changing on the, I'm using Bash, just plain vanilla Bash, say maybe to make, if I were using a curl or something like that, I have a dependency on curl, it's very minimal. And, that's not a big worry, right? Because to curl, I don't anticipate curl is going to be drastically changing, their syntax with breaking changes anytime soon. It's always a possibility, right? Anytime there's a dependency, but it's very low dependencies in that sense. Now, my biggest dependency, if I just write, Bash curl API call to the Twitter API, is the Twitter API itself, right? Because that's my biggest thing. It's like whatever I use, as long as the Twitter API doesn't change, and maybe I'm doing some security patching if I need to, right? Then I'm good. I don't have to go in and worry about an event where a dependency doesn't stay up to date with something, because I don't have anything sitting in between me and the Twitter API that needs to be kept up to date. But no matter which way you skin this, the big problem is sooner or later that Twitter API is going to change, right? And I think, given enough time, there will be breaking changes. And if it's not that API, it'll be a different API. Like, we have to have a pattern of engaging with APIs that that is resilient, right? That doesn't that helps protect us in the case that something changes. We don't want all our apps going down, right? So how do we do that, right? So if we go directly to the Twitter API, then if that changes one day, I'm maybe off on a different project. I've had this nice automation in place for a long time. I'm busy getting something totally different ready, and it's maybe a big launch or something like that. And then all of a sudden something breaks because Twitter changed their API. Maybe I didn't didn't see know it was coming, but now I've got something broken, and then it becomes a big fire drill, big problem. Now, one of the best ways to deal with that is by introducing, some abstraction. And that is, inside of development tool sets, right? Every major cloud SaaS provider makes a SDK, and a library and libraries for the popular frameworks. And so I can go into anything from JavaScript to Python to Java to, you name it, Go, probably what have you. There's Twitter or the development community, and for all the modern languages, there'll be a Twitter library that somebody maintains well. And one of the advantages of using a Twitter library inside of a development framework, if it's well maintained and it's backed by a group that's keeping it up to date, is, let's say that Twitter makes a change on the Twitter API side. Now, that can be a hard problem for everybody, but the thing is if you're using a really good Twitter library inside of your development framework, the maintainers of that library are able to do a lot to ease the impact, right, of say your upstream API changing. They may be able to do some logic in the intermediate step that allows your applications to continue working where they otherwise would break, right? And so really getting a proper development package is, I think, a really nice goal, because I said again, if you're writing some complex logic to go and make API calls, I mean, it's not the world's most complex logic, but nonetheless, you put your code out there, one day it breaks, and you've got to go back and rewrite code. No other way around it, right? If you have a reliable, dependable library that you can depend on, that to act as an intermediary, they know, if it's well maintained, they're staying up to date on what's going to happen with whatever random API happens to you. For you, it might just be one of 1,000 APIs you have to deal with, but whoever is maintaining a well maintained, Twitter library integration, they're staying up to date on that stuff, and they're going to have plans and ways to deal with any difficult things and all that stuff planned out for you by the time, hopefully, if something changes, you don't even realize that it changed if you have all of your pipelines running correctly. But to get to that ultimate destination where we want to go, like, we're going to take some step-by-step path to get there. And I think that's an important thing, because I think, oftentimes this is kind of very naturally, we write about, hey, here's how people want to see, here's a document about how to do something with Tanzu. And we're talking about, here's the best way that you could do it. All this stuff. Hey, look, this is great. This is a best practice way of doing this or that, or oh, check out this best practice architecture. But, in the real world, for so many of us, I mean, we always want to shoot for that. We always, when we're planning our project, we want to try to get as much upfront awareness and executive intervention and budget and authority that we need planned out to be able to give us some most robust implementation we can. But none of that changes that in the real world, we don't have unlimited resources. And in every IT department I've seen, is you can't just decide to be like, I'm going to go and do every single thing. Or like a good example is, like, if we think that if we look at the path between where we are today and, like, the ultimate cloud native awesomeness, right? We're on step 1 or step 2 or step 4, or step 5. And you think, if that ultimate, I've arrived at the destination sort of place is say a step 10 or step 12, and you're at the beginning, nobody's going to jump from step 1 to step 12. It's just an unrealistic idea. And so I think our environments actually and our business pressures demand that we take a stepwise path towards towards implementing, really getting to the ultimate goal. And that is absolutely the best way to do it. Absolutely the best way to do it, because you can learn and progress your skills, and you're starting to do new things, and you can take steps and get it and advance your skills and your team's skills with those steps. The biggest problem, I think, with that model is that, and it's particularly in IT, we're all very used to that, the experience we've had of, like, there was a time we had some great vision to do some great thing, and we started down that path, and somewhere down that path, we lost we lost executive support, we lost budget, we decided to be impatient and leave us sitting at an intermediate step, that wasn't really meant to be a long-term solution. So we're going to look at that intermediate, what we're going to choose here and why, and what we're going to do long-term. So first thing, since we're using GitHub Actions really as the primary workflow tool at the current time, it makes a lot of sense, go for ease, right? Like when you think about what can I use right now, especially, like, you always want to go for ease, right, first. And if you find something easy that works, even if you think, hey, is this really my long-term solution? Maybe it should be. You have, it's easy, it works, and it's reliable. Maybe it should be. Maybe you can find some of your things. But the other side is, like, having something that's easy and works for now is also okay. Again, so long as you are very diligent about establishing that plan, having full support for that plan, is really, the ideal way to go. So the first thing we want to do, since we're using GitHub Actions, is to look at the GitHub Marketplace, right? And we can search for Twitter or social media. And I did this, and I even played with a couple of these. One of the things with the GitHub Actions Marketplace is very, very new. And so aside from, like, certain very official actions, it's really unclear if these actions are going to be well maintained over time. I mean, it's one of the things when you use any dependency, the really, really big question is, how well maintained is this going to be? Because there could be something that someone's personal project, or a project that has a really good maintainer working on it at one point in time. They work on it for a year and everything's great for a year, and then they leave, and now the project falls apart, and one day you get a call in the middle of the night because your code broke because someone didn't maintain their dependency. So I think one of the big questions about actions, there are actions that are backed by big companies. The more and more different things you look into, you're going to find ones that come from unofficial sources. So always, check and make sure how many likes these have. Go to the GitHub repository. Each of these is backed by GitHub repository. Go to it. See how much activity there is. See how long the activity is. If you're building any important dependency on a GitHub action, you always want to take that time to make sure you know who the maintainers are and understand what level of commitment they have. Because if you're building software, that may need to be in place for a few years, and you don't need to wake up with having it completely pulled out from under you. So here we are with actions. Now, our goals, most of our goals are posting tweets. That's the biggest need, and we could do something that just posts tweets, but we also ideally want to, when a member signs up for the community, for example, would like to follow them, right? And maybe do other things, have the capacity to automate things other than just posting a tweet. And so I started down this path with GitHub Actions, and for me, I could not find a full-featured GitHub Action client, and so that leads into building my own action. Right now, if I had more development experience, I might think that, say, something like JavaScript might be a really good way to handle this. And the only reason why I say JavaScript is because GitHub Actions have JavaScript as a first class language, and so there's a lot of native optimizations for JavaScript that you get inside of a GitHub action that it's not necessarily going to be better, but it's at least a little bit of, there's stuff that's like pre-plumbed and pre-optimized for you if you use JavaScript that it may not be quite as smooth if you go with a different language. So we could do JavaScript. We could use a different programming language, and then in that context use one of the well-maintained developer libraries for Twitter to create a client. I'm not going to do that right now, primarily because my developer skills are iffy. right? And at the end of the day, if I'm going to put some of that development effort in, as it is a little more effort to do it that way, I want to make sure I do it in a way that really meets my long-term goals. So what I need right now is I need something that's going to help me automate tweets now. I would like it to be more full-featured than the current options are on GitHub Actions, but I'm not ready to start down the path of developing. And I found a really nice solution that I think is really a perfect fit for our intermediate step towards our long-term goal. And that is this pre-roll tweet.sh. This this is just a really elegant, simple bash script that just it worked great. I haven't done extensive testing with this yet, but I've done some simple testing, and I mean it's just as simple as could be. You pop down, when you could just copy over the files, or you could clone the repository. I cloned the repository. It's a good practice. In the event, even though this is a real simple thing, all you need are these two files and the shell script. This would be real easy just to copy over. It's a good practice because I like to clone rather than fork repositories. I don't have any intent to modify or customize, because then I know I haven't, I don't have to go through any extra things for forking if there's nothing I need to customize on here. So there's nothing in here that I wanted to push back up that I need to customize. And so in the event that they ever update this again, I can resynchronize my the clone of this directory and pull down updates if they ever do that. But that leads to the next point, which is, yeah, while this is great for its simplicity, I mean, it's super simple. You give it your passwords that you need to log into the GitHub with a developer account, which you need to be able to post to their API. You don't need, you can do one or the other. You can either the export or you can enter the values in those files. And then it's literally like, it's tweet.sh post, and then you can put a quote and put in your string and then it posts it. It's really, really simple, really, really simple. And it'll be a great way for us to be able to simply, get something that's really functional off the ground right now. And this will do a really robust job of supporting what we need right now. Of course, the amount of time that we put into this isn't being spent towards our ultimate long-term solution. And that's an important criteria. That's one of the wonderful things about how drop dead simple this is. I mean, this is just insanely simple. And so, there's a couple risks here. One is I'm putting some time into setting up this configuration, and whatever my long-term solution is, it won't be used the same exact syntax here. And so this is, this effort and this syntax is intermediate. It's an intermediary step, and it's not going to last forever. But I feel that's a worthwhile trade-off because it's so dead simple that that there's almost no effort to very, very, very minimal effort just to get this off the ground. The second factor is another big one I was talking about, which is I can see here that the last update to this last commit to this repository is back in 2019. Now, given that this is a shell script, it's extremely simple. As long as it still works with the Twitter API, fine. There shouldn't be any other negatives really to using it. The biggest negative that I see is, at some point, Twitter is going to make a breaking change to their API, I assume. And even if for some reason Twitter doesn't, if you're thinking of this as a pattern on how you deal with API-driven services, and you should think of it as a pattern, we should be consistent in our methodologies, right? We should have a methodology and a process that is robust enough to be able to accommodate for these type of considerations. Yeah, and so if GitHub, I'm sorry, if Twitter does make a breaking change in their API, then anything I have that is dependent on this, it'll be kind of dead in the water. Same as if we had written our own logic, your own API calls. Now, one big difference then of this versus making an API call is that the complexity and the time and the testing and the effort that I have to do to be able to custom script my own API call is a lot more than it would be just to build a dependency on this anyways. Right? And so if for some reason this were to go belly up at some point in time, my other relatively simpler option of using bash or PowerShell or something else or some other type of basic curl client to make to make curl calls. It's like if we have a breaking change in the API upstream API anyways, that's going to screw up something. We're going to have to be redoing things anyways. In this case, maybe it'll kill this client and I'll have to go a different route. But I feel like that's a worthwhile trade-off because this client is so much less effort for me than anything else I'm thinking of to be able to find the fastest path to getting the automated tweet working. That hey, if something were to happen to this and I end up needing to spend some more time later to find a replacement, if then it's not like I'm spending net more time because the time investment I'm spending. So I think it's a well calculated risk. So my plan for the intermediate time, we're going to go ahead and put tweet.sh, and then for longer term, I really like Spring Social. For me, there's so many things that are automated, and I know that I'm from a company that backs Spring, and so that may give me bias or what have you. Um, but I really like the effort, and I think the main reason is for me in terms of everything I've looked. I'm not the expert in everything, but I've looked. I really want to get to that point where on one hand, most of the development frameworks have a good Twitter library. Um, this likewise has a good Twitter library. But on top of it, the Spring framework, people are really putting a lot into, beyond, taking the not just the Twitter library, other, LinkedIn, which is another target, etc., other social programs, and taking the libraries that are available and adding additional enhancements and framework around them, and really a lot of meaningful framework elements and code automation, et cetera, that on one hand will, I think, help us to really develop a very robust long-term client. And in particular, it has those hallmark elements of Spring is super good at automating. You can go in and write your code and you learn a couple little things about, I write a little keyword here for Spring. And then the net result of that is that I don't need myself to put that much any more effort to my code than I would necessarily anywhere else. I need a little knowledge about how Spring works. And when I do that, Spring automatically takes the basic code I write and it adds in all these really cool things I would want, but normally like would be really, really brutally difficult to do. Like, am I writing in a way that is conducive to test-driven development? Am I writing my app in a way that's conducive to all the different troubleshooting tools and distributed tracing tools and monitoring applications and logging and DevSecOps and all of this other stuff? Is what I build, is it going to have the hooks? Is it going to have the elements present to get where I want to be? Where I want to be is I want this app to build itself. If tomorrow a dependency that I'm building on, and I want it to test itself, and when it tests itself, it should tell me, if everything's good. And if tomorrow one of my dependencies for my application has a new version come out, I want an automated process that will, in a staging area, not on my production, go out and say, oh, I'm going to do a new build, and by the way, component Z has a new version. I'm going to pull that in. I'm going to test it, and I'm going to provide a green light. Right? That's the utopia everyone wants to get to. Right? And it's definitely not something we can make it seem like it's going to be like the world's easiest thing, but I think it's getting easier and easier and easier. And if we find the right patterns and really optimize around them, I think we can hopefully over time find we'll find our way into to building out this long-term vision with Spring Social to be able to handle our social media automation needs. Okay, so that is the overview of the planning. And but now let's talk about implementation details, because there's a few different places we need to implement. And before we implement, we're going to want to do a little testing, because I've tested this on my local Bash client and works beautifully. And I've got my GitHub, we'll go through this, but I've got my GitHub environment set up where it already has GitHub secrets activated with all of my Twitter API secret keys and all that stuff. And so I haven't put anything in place to actually test the this Twitter client from GitHub Actions. But again, it's Bash, whether it's on my laptop or in GitHub Actions. So should work about the same. And yeah, so now we mentioned we have several different places in the Modern Apps Ninja website that we are looking at putting it. And the first place, or looking at adding this type of functionality. And so once we get the basic logic around about, I want to, receive take some variable, like maybe a workflow run, somebody does something, right? They complete a certificate. There's a workflow that processes the certificate completion, and that workflow already has a lot of variables, a lot of metadata about what happened that needs to be tweeted about. And so when we get the action syntax just right, we can take our step and plug it into that existing workflow, and just where we say, okay, what is it that we want to tweet, and it's going to be some metadata that exists from that workflow run. Like if somebody posted a new course, well, the workflow will be processing stuff having to do with the posting of a new course. One of the steps will be take new course description and post it out, or the first in characters of course description, something along those lines, and then post to Twitter. Now, to start, how do we want to test this? Make sure we get the GitHub Actions syntax right. And then there's a couple other ways that we might want to make this available as a service for our team. And that's where we're going to start. So the first one is with the GitHub action type we call manual dispatch. And what that allows us to do is, oh, this is not my page, but anyways, if you have GitHub Actions here, you can someone with sufficient privileges can just click on the action and start it. And it has a little input form if you need to put input variables into to do your run. And so that's a great way to start testing it, because I don't have to trigger other events. It makes it really easy for me. I just only want to test this. And so to do my test, I can do that very simple manual run, and I'll just put an input value for what I want my tweet to be in the form. Now, the manual thing is almost like a service, right? I'm just like, hey, could other people who are admins on my site run this manual work for a tweet? And the answer is absolutely yes. And so you can also have this manual workflow set up to where, like, if you're working on a project, like for our modern apps project, or whatever project that you happen to be working on, you're probably going to have several other people who are also working on your project that all want to tweet about your project, and they all probably tweet about your project using their own Twitter handles, but they may also all be doing things like adding pieces of content and things like that to your combined project. And it may be nice to democratize the ability to tweet out of a shared project account. And so yeah, you can use that manual GitHub action form. Let's see, actions here. Do I have a manual one on this one? And this one doesn't have a manual one. In a different repo, I have some manual ones. But just like there's an actor pull down here, there's like a new start workflow pull down that exists on ones that allow manual run, and you'll just see it there if you have the right permission. Now, that's a great way to create a little service for your team, allow you to share a Twitter account with GitHub. But there are some limitations to that model. So we are going to build out a little service that allows members of our community to directly tweet, not just when something automatic happens, but maybe there's an admin, someone with appropriate permissions, who wants to send out a tweet on the shared account. But it's not just one of these automated ones with automated message. They want to customize the messaging. And so once we build out our manual dispatch service, the next thing that we'll build out is a little form. And let me show you what I mean by this. So let's take inspiration from, what was that one I just did? It was for the hackathon. So if I go into, where'd the hackathon go? Hackathon. And I go into my GitHub Actions here. I have all these little hackathon awards. And the way that these work is someone posts a file to, or they open a pull request to post a file to a particular repository. And when that is, in this case, we say, if you've won this award, go to this particular subdirectory and then post a file there with information about how how you got the completed whatever you needed to do to get that award. And so people post a file, and that's a really cool thing, is it allows a manual approval process. We don't do any processing on the initial pull request. We wait till it's approved, and then once it's approved, we go back and look at see who actually was the submitter of the initial pull request, and then can run an automation from that. So you can have it to where people submit a form with some information that you could use in your workflow if you want. And then when once and you can in this case we have some workflows that we'll see that we have fully automated approvals based on, if the user posts something, we have a way to check and verify that it was valid, and so we can automatically handle that. But in many cases, like in the case of this hackathon here, we had a lot of different things that people could do awards, and it was very difficult to try to write an automated handler to verify all the different things that people could potentially do. So we wanted to have a manual approval process. And so we created this workflow that allows this manual approval process to be combined with a event trigger and GitHub action workflow. Which was a little more peculiar than I thought it was going to be when implementing it. It wasn't quite as optimized, but it's not difficult to do either. So we'll look at, after we get our initial manual dispatch workflow set up to hammer out our initial basic syntax for our tweet, then we'll go ahead and we'll create a service that it'll say, if someone posts a file, and we'll create a little YAML file that says, like me, it's really Twitter doesn't have much metadata. So we may not have anything other than, up to 140 characters. It'd actually be a little less because we may want to pad it with some of our own metadata, right? Like if we, as a feature of our automation, we might want to say, hey, when this type of event happens and you send out an automated tweet, we always want to use at ModernApps Ninja or at VMware Tanzu, for example. We may want to automate and not just tweet it, but we want to tweet it in a way where we call maybe the person who earned it. If we have their Twitter account, maybe we want to mention them in a tweet if someone earned a badge. So not just tweet it out, hey, so-and-so won a badge, but say, oh, this specific Twitter user earned a badge. And so different ways that you can set up a basic YAML or JSON document, have people post it like a template, and just one or two fields. It could just be just text. Doesn't even need to be a field. You could just say, hey, whatever you type in this particular file is going to be exactly what we put to Twitter, other than, we're going to cap it at 140 characters or something. And so you have them post that file. When they post that file, it sits and waits in a queue. You do manual approval. Once you do the manual approval, the automation will capture the approval, and it will take the tweet and it will post it. And then you can have a really robust service to allow different members of your community to share in your tweeting. And unlike the method to do a manual dispatch, one of the really nice things is, like, I could say only the super admins that I trust 100% can have access to the Twitter account. And that's not good, because what I really want is, if there's somebody who's done something really good for the community, and whether it is that to shine a light on that individual for the fact that they did something nice for the community, or whether it is to, share the news that, hey, the community has some new capability, some new content, some new feature, both, right? There's a nice synergy there. When that happens, we want to have that automation and that ability to potentially pad some additional space. And so we may say, hey, here's a document that has, you can just free-form document. It's just a plain document. You can put your tweet in it, and we're just going to, up to a certain amount of characters, we're going to, or you could actually turn it into a structured document and make a couple fields. I think the big thing is if you want to collect metadata that is not just automatically already provided in the overall GitHub metadata, then make a field. But with Twitter, that might be one that you can just really exercise that simplicity of really going, without even a field. The title of the document can essentially serve as that key in your key value pair, where the content can just be free form, and anything that's in there, assuming it's not an invalid character, and that actually saves time on processing the data and so on. So we may do that way. But the point being, you can have a form, and the really nice thing about that model as well, in addition to have that, the approval process already in place through GitOps. It I also have several workflows already in place around some of the GitHub Action workflows they have that will restrict permissions based on granular GitHub Teams membership. And it's very simple logic to do that. I've already got the logic carved out. And so one of the things when you do a manual dispatch, anybody who has write permission to your repository, which may be a lot of people if you have a lot of collaborators, because write permission, it allows people to write. But in the GitHub world, that's not that meaningful because there's a lot of other protections you can put in place. It just means somebody is at least a minimal level contributor. And if somebody has write permissions, anyone can go to a manual dispatch and just launch it. There isn't another control in place. And so if you were to use that manual dispatch, then it really limits the flexibility by which you could empower your community members to share appropriate things with you, and then have a good streamlined approval process to capture the value of those contributions. Okay, so yeah, so we'll get there, and then once we get that that service that will allow members of the community to use a Git pull request to propose a tweet for the community Twitter account. Then we'll go ahead and we'll have that logic hammered out, and we can go ahead and add in that logic to those other places where we need it for adding courses, or adding things when a new course is added, when a new tutorial added, when a new guide is added, when a new event is added. There's more potentially complex logic. We might do what happens if somebody updates one of these. In general, for a lot of this stuff, unless they disappear, we don't necessarily want to change our behavior other than possibly events. We may want to add some additional logic, because if an event gets canceled or changed, that may be something that is good to send a proactive notification about. And yeah, so that is it for the planning. Thanks everybody for joining this initial part. I will, the next session, we're gonna graduate from planning and get into hands-on work. And so I will see you in the next session. Thanks everyone for joining.